Picture this. It's November 1st, 1700. In the Grand Royal Palace of Madrid, a man lies dying at just 39 years old. But this isn't just any man. This is Charles II, King of Spain, ruler of one of the world's most powerful empires. And yet, as his physicians gather around his deathbed, they know what the autopsy will soon reveal, something so shocking, so disturbing, that it would become one of history's most infamous medical reports. When they opened his body, here's what they found: a heart no bigger than a peppercorn, lungs corroded and putrefied, intestines gangrenous and rotting, 3 large kidney stones, a single testicle, black as coal, and perhaps most haunting of all, his head was full of water, and his body contained not a single drop of blood. This wasn't the result of poison, or disease, or some medieval curse, though his contemporaries called him the Bewitched. No, this catastrophic physical collapse was the inevitable endpoint of something far more calculated, far more deliberate. 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding by one of Europe's most powerful families. The Habsburgs didn't just rule Europe, they owned it. At their peak, their empire stretched across continents where the sun never set. They controlled Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Philippines, and vast swaths of the Americas. They provided Holy Roman emperors for nearly 4 centuries. They were the political puppeteers who shaped European history through their signature strategy: strategic marriages. "Let others wage war," went their famous motto. "You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. Uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, over and over again, for generations. They believed they were preserving the purity of their bloodline, consolidating their power, keeping their wealth in the family. What they were actually doing was conducting one of history's most extreme genetic experiments, with themselves as the subjects. By the time Charles II was born, his family tree didn't branch. It formed a circle. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. Modern scientists have calculated that more than a quarter of his genome was homozygous, where both gene copies are identical, magnifying every genetic flaw, amplifying every hereditary weakness. The result? A king who couldn't walk until he was 8, couldn't speak clearly until he was 10, who drooled constantly because his tongue was too large and his jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't close his mouth or chew his food, who suffered from constant seizures, chronic digestive issues, and was completely, irreversibly infertile. When Charles II died without an heir, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. The War of Spanish Succession that followed would reshape European politics for generations. All because a family that once conquered continents couldn't produce a single healthy child. This is the story of the Habsburgs, a tale of ambition and empire, of political genius and biological catastrophe. It's about how the wealthiest, most educated, most powerful people in the world made a decision that seems incomprehensible to us today. They chose dynasty over health, power over survival, and ultimately, they chose extinction. How did it happen? Why did they continue even as the evidence mounted with each generation? And what can this 700-year-old story teach us about the dangers of isolation, of closed systems, of refusing to let fresh perspectives, or in this case, fresh genes, into our circles? This is the Habsburg Paradox, the rise and fall of a dynasty that conquered the world, only to be conquered by their own DNA. Every empire starts somewhere. For the Habsburgs, it began not in a golden palace or an ancient capital, but in a modest fortress perched on a hill in what is now Switzerland. In the year 2020, Count Radbot and Bishop Werner of Strasbourg built a castle overlooking the Ahr River. They called it Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle. The name would evolve into Habsburg, and from this single stone fortress on a Swiss hillside, one of history's most powerful dynasties would emerge. For 2.5 centuries, the Habsburgs were little more than minor nobility, important enough to matter locally, but nowhere near the corridors of real power. They married, they had children, they managed their estates, they were patient. Then came 1273. The Holy Roman Empire needed a new emperor, and the prince-electors found themselves in a delicate situation. The major powers were at each other's throats, each too strong to let another dominate. They needed a compromise candidate, someone important enough to be legitimate, but not powerful enough to threaten anyone. Enter Rudolf I, the 7th-generation descendant of Count Radbot. On October 1st, 127, in Frankfurt, he was unanimously elected King of the Romans. 3 weeks later, in Charlemagne's cathedral at Aachen, he was crowned. The Habsburgs had entered the game. But Rudolf was more than just a placeholder. He was a shrewd operator who understood something fundamental. Titles meant nothing without land, and land meant nothing without heirs to hold it. In 1282, he made the move that would define his dynasty for the next 6 centuries. He bestowed Austria and Styria upon his sons Albert and Rudolf. From that moment forward, the story of the Habsburgs would be inseparable from Austria. They had found their kingdom. Now they needed a strategy to expand it. The real architect of Habsburg power wasn't a warrior or a general. It was Maximilian I, and his weapon of choice wasn't the sword, it was the wedding ring. Born in 1459, Maximilian understood something that would revolutionize dynastic politics. In an age of endless warfare, marriage was cheaper than armies and more permanent than conquest. You could lose a battle, but a wedding created ties that lasted generations. In 1477, at age 18, Maximilian executed the first great Habsburg marriage coup. When Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, died in battle, his daughter Mary became one of the most valuable brides in Europe. Burgundy wasn't just wealthy, it was obscenely rich. The trading centers of Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp made it an economic powerhouse. The Low Countries, Artois, Luxembourg, Franche-Comté, all this came into Habsburg hands through a single wedding. But Maximilian was just getting started. He pioneered what historians call the Habsburg matrimonial policy, a systematic, multi-generational strategy of arranged marriages designed to accumulate territory, alliances, and power without firing a shot. His son Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish Catholic monarchs who had just unified Spain and funded Columbus's voyage to the Americas. Through this marriage, the Habsburgs positioned themselves to inherit not just Spain, but its rapidly expanding colonial empire. When Philip and Joanna's son was born in 1500, he inherited a realm unlike anything Europe had ever seen. History would know him as Charles V, and the empire he ruled would stretch so far that it literally never experienced nightfall. The sun never set on Charles V's domain. Think about what this meant. Charles ruled Spain and its American colonies, the Habsburg Netherlands and their trading empire, Austria and the German lands, Naples, Sicily, and Milan in Italy, the Philippines in Asia. He was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, giving him nominal authority over much of Central Europe. One man, one dynasty, unprecedented power, all achieved primarily through marriage. A famous Latin couplet captured their strategy. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And it worked spectacularly. But there was a problem hiding in this success, one that wouldn't become obvious for several generations. When you accumulate power through marriage, You create a limited pool of suitable partners. You can't just marry anyone. Your spouse must be of appropriate royal rank. They must bring political advantages. They must not create complications with existing alliances. And most importantly, they must not dilute the family's claim to its territories. The solution seemed obvious. Marry within the family. Keep everything in the House of Habsburg. Uncle marries niece. First cousins marry each other. The family tree begins to curve back on itself. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. After all, royal intermarriage was common across Europe. Every noble house did it to some extent. The Habsburgs were just being thorough. Charles V himself married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son, Philip II of Spain, married his own niece, Anna of Austria. This wasn't scandal, it was strategy. Each marriage reinforced Habsburg control, kept territories from fragmenting, maintained the purity of succession. But with each generation, something subtle was happening in the Habsburg bloodline. Each marriage between close blood relatives increased the likelihood that offspring would inherit two copies of the same gene, including harmful recessive genes that would normally remain hidden. The inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how much of your genome is identical by descent, started to climb. For comparison, a child of unrelated parents has an inbreeding coefficient near 0. First cousins who marry have children with a coefficient of about 0.0625. The Habsburgs were about to push that number to levels previously unseen in a major royal dynasty. In 1556, Charles V made a fateful decision. His empire was too vast for one man to rule. He split it between his brother Ferdinand, who got Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, and his son Philip II, who inherited Spain, the Netherlands, and the colonies. Two branches of the Habsburg family, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs, each determined to maintain their power through the family's proven strategy, strategic marriage. And increasingly, that meant marrying each other. The Spanish branch would pursue this strategy with particular intensity. Between 1516 and 1700, over 80% of marriages in the Spanish Habsburg line were between close blood relatives. 9 of 11 marriages over 2 centuries were between close relatives. 2 uncle-niece marriages, multiple first cousin unions, even a double first cousin marriage. They thought they were preserving their dynasty. They were actually guaranteeing its extinction. The genetic time bomb was ticking. It would take nearly 2 centuries to explode, but when it did, the result would be catastrophic enough to end a royal line and trigger a European war. But before we get to the endpoint, we need to understand exactly what was happening to Habsburg bodies, Habsburg minds, and Habsburg faces as that inbreeding coefficient crept steadily upward with each passing generation. To understand how the Habsburgs destroyed themselves, we need to understand something about how genetics works, particularly what happens when the same genetic material gets combined over and over again. Every human carries 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. For most genes, this is fine. Even if one copy is defective, the other can compensate. These harmful variations are called recessive because they're hidden when paired with a normal copy. But here's the problem. When relatives have children together, they're much more likely to pass the same genes to their offspring. Both copies might be defective. When that happens, recessive genetic disorders emerge. In small doses, this might cause minor problems, a slightly increased risk of certain diseases, a marginally higher chance of developmental issues. But the Habsburgs weren't dealing with small doses. They were conducting an extreme genetic experiment spanning 2 centuries. In 2009, a groundbreaking study published in PLOS One examined the Habsburg family tree in unprecedented detail. Researchers reconstructed genealogical records for more than 3,000 Habsburg family members across 16 generations. The findings were stunning. The inbreeding coefficient for Philip I, who founded the Spanish Habsburg line in 1504, was a relatively modest 0.025. Not ideal, but not catastrophic. By the time we get to Charles II, born in 1661, that number had exploded to 0.254. Let me put that in perspective. An inbreeding coefficient of 0.25 is what you'd expect from a brother-sister or parent-child relationship. Charles II's parents were uncle and niece, but his coefficient was even higher than that single incestuous union would produce. Why? Because he didn't just have one generation of inbreeding, he had dozens of them, all compounding on each other. The study's conclusion was stark. Inbreeding directly caused a 17.8% reduction in survival rates. For the Habsburg children, this wasn't theoretical. Of 34 Habsburg children born between 1527 and 1661, 17, exactly half, died before their 10th birthday. 10 died before age 1. Compare this to contemporary Spanish villages, where infant mortality was around 20%. The Habsburgs were killing their children through their marriage practices, and the evidence was written on their faces. Stand in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and you can watch the Habsburg face deform over time. In the early portraits, they look normal, powerful, certainly, regal, yes, but anatomically ordinary. As you walk through the gallery chronologically, something starts to change. Jaws begin to protrude. Lower lips thicken and hang. Noses elongate and droop. The face stretches and distorts, generation after generation, until you reach the final portraits and see faces that look almost alien. This wasn't artistic style. It was genetic reality. In 2019, researchers published a study in the Annals of Human Biology that finally proved what historians had long suspected. They recruited 10 maxillofacial surgeons, doctors who specialize in facial structure, and had them analyze 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg family members. The surgeons diagnosed 11 specific features of a protruding lower jaw and 7 features of maxillary deficiency, which refers to the upper face problems. Then they correlated these diagnoses with the family's inbreeding coefficients. The relationship was undeniable. The more inbred a Habsburg was, the more severe their facial deformity. They called it the Habsburg jaw, and it's now one of the most famous examples of how inbreeding affects physical development. The medical term is mandibular prognathism, a condition where the lower jaw grows too far forward, creating a severe underbite, along with a protruding lower lip, a prominent misshapen nose, and drooping eyelids. The study found that 22% of the variation in jaw severity among the Habsburgs could be attributed to inbreeding levels alone. Philip IV of Spain had the most pronounced case in the portraits studied. But he wasn't the final, most extreme example. That distinction belonged to the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II. Carlos II of Spain, Charles the Bewitched, was the inevitable endpoint of the Habsburg genetic experiment, and his life was a catalogue of medical horror. He was born in 1661, the long-awaited male heir to Philip IV. The Spanish court celebrated. The dynasty would continue, but almost immediately, it was clear something was terribly wrong. As an infant, Charles couldn't nurse properly. His tongue was too large, and his jaw was so misaligned that creating suction was nearly impossible. He suffered from constant drooling and choking. The bones of his skull hadn't fused properly at age 3, leaving soft spots that should have closed in infancy. He didn't walk until age 8, didn't speak intelligibly until age 10. Even then, His speech remained slurred and difficult to understand for his entire life. His tongue was described as locked, so large it wouldn't fit properly in his mouth. He couldn't chew solid food, often swallowing it whole or regurgitating it. His growth was stunted. His body was weak. He suffered from chronic diarrhea and vomiting. He had frequent epileptic seizures. His legs and abdomen would swell with edema, swelling caused by fluid retention. He was constantly ill with infections his body couldn't fight off. Contemporary observers described him as having a face of an idiot. His Habsburg jaw was so extreme that his teeth didn't meet. Upper and lower sets existed in separate planes. His head seemed too large for his weak, bony body. His eyes were described as vacant. Modern medical researchers have proposed several possible diagnoses. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his growth problems and delayed development. Distal renal tubular acidosis, which could cause his kidney stones and weakness. Possible Klinefelter syndrome, which might explain his infertility. But the most likely explanation? Multiple autosomal recessive disorders, all activated simultaneously because he inherited defective copies of the same genes from both parents, who were themselves the products of generations of inbreeding. He was given the best education, the finest tutors, every advantage. But the biological damage was too severe. Charles could barely read or write. He signed state documents with a shaky, childish hand. His council ruled in his name while he shuffled through palace corridors, a ghost haunting his own kingdom. The Habsburg obsession with pure bloodlines meant that finding a bride for Charles II was paradoxically difficult. Who would marry this severely disabled king? And more pressingly, could he produce an heir? At age 18, he married Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV of France. The marriage was a political necessity and a personal disaster. For 10 years, Marie-Louise endured a marriage to a man who was mentally and physically incapable of normal human interaction. Contemporary sources suggest Charles may have been impotent, or at best, barely functional. No children came. Marie-Louise died in 1689, possibly of appendicitis, though some whispered of poison, escape by any means from an intolerable situation. A second marriage was quickly arranged, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. The same result, no children. By now, Charles was in his 30s, and it was clear to everyone that the Spanish Habsburg line would die with him. The question of succession consumed European politics. Who would inherit the Spanish Empire when the childless, dying king finally succumbed? France had claims. Austria had claims. The balance of power in Europe hung on the body of one genetically catastrophic man. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, just shy of his 39th birthday. The autopsy report reads like something from a horror novel. Every organ system had failed. His body was described as corrupted, putrid, and barely recognizable as human. He had been king for 35 years, but he had never truly ruled, and he left no heir. The War of Spanish Succession broke out almost immediately, a 13-year conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and redrew the map of Europe, all because a family desperate to preserve their bloodline had instead poisoned it beyond repair. But here's the question we still haven't answered. Why? They weren't stupid. The Spanish Habsburg court included some of Europe's finest minds. They had access to physicians, scholars, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. They could see what was happening, each generation weaker, sicker, more deformed than the last. So why didn't they stop? Why did they continue marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, even as the evidence of disaster mounted with each birth? To answer that, we need to understand not the biology, but the politics of blood. Imagine you're a Habsburg archduke in 1600. You've been raised from birth to understand one absolute truth. Your bloodline is sacred. You are descended from emperors and kings. Your ancestors built the greatest empire since Rome. Your family name itself is synonymous with power. Now imagine someone suggesting you marry a commoner, or even a minor noble from a lesser house. The very idea would be absurd, not just politically unacceptable, but almost philosophically impossible. It would be like suggesting you give up being human. This is the trap the Habsburgs built for themselves. And once they were in it, escape became increasingly difficult, and eventually, impossible. Let's start with the practical politics. When Charles V split the Habsburg Empire in 1556, he created a problem that would haunt his descendants for the next 150 years. How do you keep a divided empire unified? The Austrian Habsburgs controlled the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. The Spanish Habsburgs ruled Spain, the Americas, the Philippines, the Italian territories, and the Low Countries. Together, they were unstoppable. Divided, they were merely very powerful. Intermarriage between the two branches wasn't just preferable, it was seen as essential. A marriage to an Austrian cousin reinforced Spanish claims in Central Europe. A marriage to a Spanish cousin gave Austrian Habsburgs leverage in Mediterranean politics and access to American silver. But there was a more immediate concern: territorial integrity. Under the inheritance laws of the time, kingdoms and territories passed through marriage. If a Habsburg princess married a French prince, and they had children, suddenly French blood had a claim on Habsburg territories. This had happened before. The Habsburgs themselves had accumulated much of their empire exactly this way, marrying heiresses whose lands then folded into Habsburg control. They knew the danger intimately, because they'd weaponized it. The solution? Keep marriages in the family. Habsburg women marry Habsburg men. No foreign claims. No territorial fragmentation. Everything stays under Habsburg control. It made perfect political sense. And it was genetic suicide. But politics alone doesn't explain the intensity of Habsburg inbreeding. To understand that, we need to grasp something about how European aristocracy thought about blood in the 16th and 17th centuries. They believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that royal blood was fundamentally different from common blood. Not metaphorically different. Actually, biologically, essentially different. Noble blood was thought to carry qualities of leadership, dignity, courage, and divine favor. Mixing it with common blood would dilute these qualities, weakening the line. This wasn't just snobbery. It was theology mixed with proto-biology. The divine right of kings rested on the idea that God had chosen certain bloodlines to rule. Marrying outside those bloodlines was seen as rejecting God's order. For the Habsburgs, this belief reached almost theological intensity. They were the defenders of Catholicism, the emperors of Christendom, the chosen instruments of God's will in Europe. Their bloodline wasn't just pure, it was sacred. Philip II of Spain, who married his niece Anna of Austria, saw this union not as problematic, but as ideal. He was preserving the Habsburg bloodline in its purest form. The fact that their son, the future Philip III, suffered from serious health problems was attributed to God's will, not to genetics, a concept that wouldn't be understood for another 2 centuries. This belief system created a feedback loop. The more the Habsburgs intermarried, the more they believed in the special nature of Habsburg blood. And the more they believed in it, the more unthinkable it became to marry outside the family. There was also a ruthlessly practical element to Habsburg marriage strategy. By the late 1500s, they'd essentially monopolized the highest tier of European royalty. Who could a Spanish Habsburg marry? The French royal family was the enemy. Wars between Habsburg and Valois, then Habsburg and Bourbon, dominated 16th and 17th century European politics. The English had broken with Rome, making them religiously unacceptable. The Portuguese were acceptable, but Portugal was small and already largely under Spanish influence. That left other Habsburgs. The Austrian branch offered partners who were reliably Catholic, politically aligned, and carried no risk of foreign territorial claims. For the Austrian side, the calculation was similar. Marriage to Spain meant access to American silver to fund wars against the Ottomans. It meant military cooperation. It meant presenting a united front in the endless religious conflicts of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Each Habsburg marriage, even between close relatives, came with detailed political calculations. Treaties were signed. Alliances were formalized. Military support was promised. These weren't just weddings. They were instruments of statecraft. The fact that these marriages also produced children with severe genetic problems wasn't ignored, but it was outweighed, or rationalized away, by the immediate political benefits. Here's what's particularly fascinating. The Habsburgs had access to the best physicians in Europe. The Spanish court employed dozens of doctors. These men documented the health problems of Habsburg children in detail. They noted the pattern. Children of closely related parents tended to be weaker, sicker, more likely to die young. Yet there's almost no record of any doctor explicitly advising against marriages between close blood relatives. Why? Partly, it's because the genetic mechanism wasn't understood. Mendel wouldn't discover the laws of heredity until 1866, long after the Spanish Habsburgs were extinct. Without understanding genes and inheritance, it was difficult to connect the dots between marriage patterns and health outcomes. But partly, it's because explicitly challenging royal marriage policy was dangerous. These weren't academic debates. They were matters of state, involving the highest levels of power. A doctor who too loudly suggested that the king's marriage choice was producing defective children might find himself unemployed, or worse. So instead, we get euphemism. Habsburg children are described as delicate, or weak, or under divine trial. Their problems are attributed to anything but the obvious cause: astrological influence, maternal impression, witchcraft, hence Charles II's nickname, the Bewitched. The truth was visible, but it couldn't be spoken. By the time Charles II needed a wife, the situation had become grimly ironic. The obsession with pure Habsburg blood had produced a king so damaged that continuing the line was biologically impossible. His two marriages were carefully chosen for political advantage. But no amount of political calculation could overcome the simple fact: Charles II was infertile. Whether due to hormonal problems, anatomical issues, psychological damage, or simple physiological inability, the result was the same: no children. The Habsburg strategy had reached its logical conclusion. They had preserved their bloodline so successfully that it could no longer reproduce. When Charles II finally died in 1700, the Spanish court and the whole of Europe knew what was coming: war. The War of Spanish Succession would last from 1701 to 1714, involving every major European power. Hundreds of thousands would die. The map of Europe would be redrawn. The final cost of Habsburg inbreeding wasn't just medical or dynastic. It was continental in scope, a war that shaped European politics for generations, all because one family couldn't or wouldn't accept new blood into their line. The Austrian Habsburgs learned from this catastrophe. After 1700, they began to marry outside the immediate family more frequently. They adopted more children from cadet branches. They survived. But the Spanish Habsburg line was extinct, ended not by conquest, not by revolution, but by genetic collapse. And yet, for all their failures, the Habsburgs left something behind, a legacy that still shapes Europe today. Walk through Vienna today, and you're walking through a Habsburg museum. The Habsburg Palace, their winter residence, a vast complex that grew over centuries, each generation adding their mark. Schönbrunn Palace, their summer retreat, 1,441 rooms of Baroque splendor, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Spanish Riding School, the Imperial Crypt, countless churches and monuments. Travel to Spain, and the Habsburg legacy is everywhere. The Royal Palace of Madrid, the Monastery of El Escorial, Philip II's austere masterpiece, the layout of colonial cities across Latin America, still following Habsburg urban planning principles centuries after the dynasty fell. For all their biological failures, the Habsburgs were extraordinary patrons of culture, architecture, and art. They commissioned works from Titian, Velázquez, and Rubens. They built some of Europe's finest Baroque architecture. They established traditions and institutions that outlived them by centuries. But their most important legacy isn't artistic, it's cautionary. The Habsburg story is one of the clearest examples in human history of how closed systems ultimately fail. Modern genetics has allowed us to see exactly what the Habsburgs did to themselves. And it's not pretty. A 2019 study using genome analysis techniques on Habsburg family members showed that the genetic load, the accumulation of harmful mutations, increased dramatically over time. Each generation carried more deleterious genes than the last, and as those genes became homozygous, where both gene copies are identical, through inbreeding, they shifted from hidden to expressed. The Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower jaw, is now understood to be caused by mutations in genes affecting bone growth and development. Normally, if you carry one defective copy, it doesn't matter. The normal copy compensates. But if you inherit the same defective copy from both parents, as was increasingly likely in Habsburg marriages, the condition manifests. Researchers have identified this same pattern across multiple genetic disorders in the Habsburg line. It's a textbook case of inbreeding depression, the reduced biological fitness in a given population as a result of breeding from related individuals. The infant mortality rate tells the story starkly. By the final generation of Spanish Habsburgs, 50% of children died before age 10. That's not just bad luck. That's genetic disaster playing out in real time, documented in family records and medical reports that still survive. The extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line triggered the War of Spanish Succession, which reshaped European politics. But more significantly, it triggered a rethinking of dynastic strategy across Europe's royal families. After 1700, even very conservative royal houses began to diversify their marriage patterns. The lesson had been learned, if not always articulated explicitly. Extreme inbreeding is a path to extinction. The Austrian Habsburgs, who survived until 1918, notably expanded their marriage pool after seeing what happened to their Spanish cousins. They still practiced some degree of cousin marriage. Most European royalty did, but they avoided the extreme uncle-niece and double cousin marriages that had doomed the Spanish line. Ironically, this made them more politically flexible, marrying into French, Bavarian, Saxon, and other German houses created networks of alliance that served Austria well through the turbulent 18th and 19th centuries. The Habsburg experience also influenced the development of marriage laws. Most modern Western nations prohibit marriage between close relatives, and while these laws are usually justified on moral grounds, the biological reasoning is pure Habsburg. Too much inbreeding causes serious genetic problems. The Habsburg story has become a reference point for discussions about dynasties, power, and the dangers of isolation. Habsburg jaw is now a term used beyond genetics. It's shorthand for what happens when elite groups become too insular, too convinced of their own specialness. Business schools teach the Habsburg case study as a warning about organizational insularity. When companies only promote from within, only hire from a narrow pool, only listen to familiar voices, they risk their own version of inbreeding depression, intellectual stagnation, inability to adapt, eventual failure. Political scientists reference the Habsburgs when discussing the dangers of closed political systems. When ruling classes become too insular, too disconnected from broader society, too convinced of their inherent superiority, they make increasingly poor decisions until they collapse under the weight of their own incompetence. The metaphor extends to any closed system: religious communities that don't allow outside influence, academic fields that don't welcome new perspectives, cultural movements that police their boundaries too strictly. Any system that confuses purity with strength is walking the Habsburg path. So what can we, in the 21st century, learn from a dynasty that ended more than 300 years ago? First, diversity isn't just morally right, it's biologically and systemically essential. The Habsburg genetic collapse wasn't a moral failing, it was a practical failure to maintain sufficient genetic diversity. Any system that doesn't regularly introduce new elements will eventually accumulate problems that compound until the system fails. Second, short-term advantage can create long-term catastrophe. Each Habsburg marriage made perfect sense in its immediate context. The political benefits were clear. The genetic costs were invisible, or at least deniable. But those costs accumulated silently, emerging only generations later as disaster. How many of our modern choices follow the same pattern? Third, warning signs ignored don't disappear, they compound. The Habsburgs had evidence. They saw weaker children. They noted higher mortality rates. They documented the physical deformities. But because acknowledging the problem would require changing their fundamental strategy, they rationalized, minimized, and attributed the problems to anything but their own choices. The parallel to modern climate change, antibiotic resistance, or any number of slowly accumulating catastrophes is hard to ignore. Fourth, elite insularity is self-destructive. The Habsburgs believed their blood was special, that they were fundamentally different from ordinary people, that mixing with outsiders would weaken them. In reality, their isolation weakened them far more than any outside influence could have. Any elite group, whether defined by wealth, education, ethnicity, or ideology, that becomes too convinced of its own specialness is walking toward the same cliff. Fifth, power doesn't protect you from reality. The Habsburgs were the most powerful family in Europe. They could command armies, reshape borders, and control the lives of millions. But they couldn't command biology. They couldn't reshape genetics through force of will. There are limits that power cannot overcome, and pretending otherwise doesn't change the outcome. Here's the ultimate Habsburg paradox. They achieved everything they set out to do, and it destroyed them. They wanted to preserve their bloodline, and they preserved it so well that it died out. They wanted to keep their power concentrated, and concentrated it so much it became brittle and broke. They wanted to maintain their territories, and their strategy to maintain them led to a massive European war that redistributed those territories to other hands. The Habsburg story is a tragedy in the classical sense, not a story of evil people doing evil things, but of people making rational choices within their own framework, each decision seeming reasonable at the time. The catastrophe emerging only when you can see the whole arc of the story from beginning to end. From our modern perspective, it seems obvious what they should have done. Just marry outside the family more often. Just introduce some new genetic material into the line. Just value health over political convenience. But that's the privilege of hindsight. From inside the system, accepting those solutions would have required abandoning core beliefs about blood, nobility, territorial integrity, and divine right. It would have required admitting that their entire worldview was flawed. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all. The hardest problems to solve are the ones that require us to question our most fundamental assumptions. The Habsburgs couldn't save themselves because saving themselves would have required them to stop being Habsburgs, at least. Habsburgs as they understood themselves. In the end, they chose to be true to their principles, and their principles killed them. On November 1st, 1700, when Charles II died in that Madrid palace, an era ended. The empire that had stretched across continents, that had defended Catholicism and shaped European history for 2 centuries, that had produced emperors and kings and generals, died with a man who could barely speak, could barely walk, who spent his entire miserable life as a prisoner of his own genetics. The autopsy report, with its horrifying details, that peppercorn heart, those gangrenous intestines, that head full of water, reads like a metaphor made flesh. Here was the ultimate endpoint of purity, of insularity, of a system that valued maintenance of itself over adaptation and survival. But here's what makes the Habsburg story both tragic and relevant. They weren't monsters. They weren't stupid. They were people with a strategy that had worked brilliantly for centuries. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. That strategy built an empire. And then it destroyed that empire. The Spanish Habsburgs ended, but their legacy persists. Not just in the palaces and paintings, though those are spectacular. Not just in the political boundaries they drew, though those still matter. Their real legacy is the lesson, if we're willing to learn it. Closed systems fail. Insularity is fragile. Purity is an illusion that mistakes uniformity for strength. Diversity, genetic, intellectual, cultural, isn't a luxury or a political stance. It's a survival strategy, proven over millions of years of evolution and violated by the Habsburgs with predictable results. Walk through the portrait galleries of Vienna today, and you can see the warning written on those elongated faces, those jutting jaws, those heavy-lidded eyes. Each generation is a marker on a path toward extinction. And yet they kept walking it, right to the end. Why? Because changing course would have required admitting that their entire worldview was wrong, that their special blood wasn't special, that their divine mandate was a story they told themselves, that they were, in the end, just people subject to the same biological laws as everyone else. That's a hard thing to accept when you're an emperor. It's hard to accept when you're at the top of any hierarchy, convinced that the rules that govern others don't apply to you. But the Habsburg corpse in that Madrid palace proved otherwise. Reality doesn't care about your titles or your traditions or how many people call you Your Majesty. The question that haunts the Habsburg story is this: at what point could they have stopped? Was there a moment, a specific marriage, a specific generation, where a different choice would have changed the outcome? The mathematics of inbreeding suggests yes. If the Spanish Habsburgs had introduced even occasional outside marriages, the genetic load could have been managed. The inbreeding coefficient could have been kept below the critical threshold. Children would still have been born, some healthy enough to reproduce. But that would have required someone to recognize the pattern, understand its cause, and have the courage and authority to change course. And it would have required the Habsburg family to accept that their strategy, which had brought them such spectacular success, was also killing them. That's the cruelest paradox of all. The thing that made them great was the same thing that destroyed them. Their discipline, their consistency, their unwavering commitment to their dynastic strategy, these were virtues that became vices. Success can be a trap. What works in one context can be catastrophic in another. Strategies that produce short-term gains can create long-term disaster. And sometimes, survival requires abandoning the very principles that made you successful in the first place. The Habsburgs couldn't make that leap. Perhaps no one could have, trapped in their time and culture and beliefs. But the lesson remains: adapt or die. Open your system or watch it collapse. Welcome the outside or perish from within. In the end, the Habsburg Paradox resolves simply: you cannot build an empire on isolation. You cannot maintain power through purity. You cannot rule the world while refusing to let the world into your bloodline. The Habsburgs tried. For 200 years, they tried. And on a November day in 1700, their experiment ended the only way it could: in genetic catastrophe, political crisis, and the extinction of a dynasty that had once made Europe tremble. The portraits remain. The palaces stand. The lesson echoes across the centuries. Listen carefully. You might hear it in your own life, your own organizations, your own tightly controlled circles. The Habsburg whisper: open the doors or close them forever.